All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Sorry for the late start, but it's all good. It's Friday. So for those of you, there's a couple people who weren't here last week. Last week was just an introduction, so you didn't really miss anything, but I'm going to just go over real quick what the class is. I entitled the class, Who is God? But what we're going to be discussing is attributes of God, and it's going to be using scripture and theology to discuss those attributes. Last week I said that God is both infinite and personal, and we're going to be talking about his infinite attributes. That can be a little confusing, so another way you want to think of it, the word is called incommunicable. Actually, I don't know how to spell that word, so I'm not gonna. But rather than infinite, they're called his incommunicable attributes, and what that means is that when we were created in the likeness of God, we were given some of his qualities. But then some of his qualities we weren't given. So these are those attributes that we're going to discuss first. That's what I mean by infinite, is that things that we talked about last week, like God being omniscient, God being all-powerful, these are things that God did not give to us. These are things that solely he possesses. So we're going to talk about those things first. And last week what I said the first one we're going to talk about is called aseity, God's aseity. This comes from the two Latin words. It's just se. And what this basically means is God's self-existence, that God is uncaused. The words literally mean in Latin is from self or in self, like God exists se, like God exists in himself. He does not have a reason for his existence other than himself, like he doesn't have a cause outside of God. Oftentimes philosophers will say that if something caused God, then that would be God. So he is his own cause. Ravi Zacharias sort of really quickly explains it this way: God is the only being whose reason for being is in himself. So the way these classes are going to work, they're going to break down the same basically every week. We're going to start with a Bible study, a biblical study of this attribute. Then we're going to move on to the philosophical and theological study of the attribute. And then after that, we're going to talk about objections to the attribute or complications that arise from it. I'm starting with this one because there actually aren't any objections to this one. It seems like very complicated and hard to grasp, but it's actually the one that even atheists sort of accept. They'll say that if God exists, he must have this quality. So that's why I'm starting there. So if you didn't bring your Bibles, it's fine, but we're going to start with the biblical data. We'll put the verses up, and they're also on your sheet. So the first one I want to start in the Old Testament with Isaiah, and it's Isaiah chapter 40, we're going to start in verse 17. My version may be different than that version. I think we're the same. So he starts, all nations are as nothing before him. They are regarded by him as less than nothing and meaningless. To who then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare with him? As for the idol, a craftsman crafts it, a goldsmith plates it with gold, a silversmith fashions chains of silver. He who is too impoverished for such an offering selects a tree that does not rot. He seeks out for himself a skillful craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He it is who reduces rulers to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. So now what Isaiah is saying is he's comparing God, Yahweh, to sort of the false gods and the false idols of the time, and these things were all created by someone else. They were like, as he says, like the craftsman sort of makes it, and he's saying that God is so much above these things. God is not created by anything. God is not crafted by anything. He portrays God as like the uncreated creator above everything else. And to Isaiah, like, God is unique in this. In Isaiah's time, looking at all these false religions, he's saying that our God is nothing like these gods. The God of Christianity is totally unique in that he is not made by a craftsman's hands. He is above it all. Now we'll go to, and as we're going, I'm going to sort of explain the verses. Now we'll go to the New Testament in Revelations 4:11, and there's just really one word I want to focus on. in this verse. Oh, sorry, I should have went ahead to mine. So bear with me for a second. And I'm going to jump around a lot, both Old and New Testaments. So Revelation 4:11 says that, "Worthy are you, our Lord, our God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and because of your will they have existed and were created." Now, the key word in this is that God is creator of all things. He doesn't include himself in that. So the very existence of everything else is dependent upon God except for his own existence. Now, one of the key verses that describes this quality of God, God's aseity, God's self-existence, I'm going to keep repeating the word to sort of ingrain it in your head, is John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. It's a verse everybody knows, but it says a lot in this verse. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being." So the end of that verse is saying that all things that have come into being are through him. So again, that would mean that he must exist before anything else existed. This verse also it mentions in the beginning, and what John is talking about, in the beginning before anything, in the beginning of even time, that before the world existed, God and the Word existed. Now in this verse, John is talking about, he calls the Word God, but he sort of separates them, but what he's talking about is, he's talking about Christ. He's talking about God and Christ. Now, many of these verses are also reiterated in the New Testament describing Christ, like all these qualities that God has, that they're also given to Christ. However, I'm not going to dive too deep in that. We're just basically talking about general qualities of God, and then in the future, when we get to Christ's divinity and the Trinity, I'm going to be talking a lot more about that. But in this verse, there's a hint of where we're going there. I want to also say about this verse that in the part where it says that, wait, hold on, let me read my notes. Sorry, I'm a little flustered. That in the Greek, it says that it can mean that all things came into being through him. Oh wait, that's what this one says. Okay, never mind. When I was writing it up, I must have been using a different version. So, God is the self-existent first cause of all other things. Everything that was created through God. And without God, like nothing else would exist. If God did not exist, nothing would exist. He is the cause of everything. Now let's go to Nehemiah 9:6. So Nehemiah 9:6 says that, "You alone are the Lord. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their hosts, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to all of them, and the heavenly hosts bow down before you." So again, this is just reinforcing that everything comes through God. Everything is created through God, even the heavens, even the angels, even the hosts. That everything that exists finds its source in God. Yet his source doesn't have a cause. Like he is not created by something else. God has just always been. He is, as I said, self-existent. He is the reason for his being. Now, the other thing that a lot of these verses will say, that let's go actually real quick before I say this. Romans 11, verse 36. There's another thing I want to hint on here. This says, "For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." And then also, Hebrews 2:10 also follows from that at the end of it. It says, "For whom and by whom all things exist." Now, it's not just saying that God then created these things, but also and then we just existed. But it's also through God that we exist. That his very, what's the word I'm looking for? That if he basically stopped thinking about existence would cease to exist, is sort of a way to say it. That God sustains existence through himself, that it's through him that existence exists. And this sort of is an objection to what is called deism. Deists will say that that God just created everything and then he sort of disappeared. And then creation sustains itself. But the Bible hints that God is the sustainer of all creation. Like he continues to sustain creation. Like he didn't. So let's go to Psalms 92, chapter 90, verse 2. Again, before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So the psalmist here is then even talking before anything even was. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And I think tense is very important there too. I don't think that was a mistake. That even before anything existed, God still is. You are God. And then this leads into sort of my favorite verse that sort of enumerates this quality of God. Let's let Tommy come in and sit down. What's up, Tom? So again, my favorite verse again that indicates this quality of self-existence in God comes from Exodus 3:14, when Moses is asking God, like, who should I say sent me? And God says to Moses, I am who I am. And you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Again, God's name that he gives for Moses is just I am. Basically existence. I exist. I am. Now it's interesting that, many people might have heard about what's called artificial intelligence, have heard about the pursuit of scientists to create artificial intelligence. There's another quality of this called artificial awareness that they've been studying, that could a machine become self-aware? Could we create a machine that would have that? And what a lot of mathematicians and scientists are saying now is that it's actually a mathematical impossibility, that the statement I am is meaningless mathematically, like it is impossible to create that. And that many of these scientists think that you cannot create consciousness from non-consciousness, like that it cannot be created. And they believe that it is just in the very nature of existence that consciousness exists, that I am awareness, self-awareness has always existed. Again, they don't say, God has always existed, but they're just saying because consciousness exists, it must have always existed. And again, this is given to us from God. It's a gift from God, and this, I think, is in the way that we are like God. It says in the beginning, like that God created us in his image. And when God gives his name, I am, he gives that quality to us. Again, it's like try to describe the words I am outside of just saying I am. Like, it is indescribable. So again, when we talk about God's aseity, God's self-existence, I am that I am. He just is. So, for right now, I want to sort of open up to any questions or comments on the biblical side of this. If anybody wants to add anything or has any questions. Tommy, I know you just walked in, so you might not even know what we're talking about.
I don't. I will try to find out.
There are, like I said, many more verses. These are just a sampling. But I think that in the very scripture itself, this quality of God's self-existence is very apparent. Is it a quick question or a long question?
As an observation, the scripture says, from him and through him and to him.
Yes. Yes. That is something I was going to get to further down the road, but for right now. Yes, that even what I said last week in the intro, that I said the purpose of life is to know God, like whether or not you're a Christian. That I think as a believer, even for non-believers, the purpose of life is knowledge of God, to know God. And that's why I said the point of this class is I can't help you to know God personally. That is like up to you. But I can tell you things about God that can help you to know God, that tell you about his qualities, tell you what he's like. So that, Tommy, since you missed last week, that's sort of what this class is. We're going to be talking about attributes of God. And this first one is that God's self-existence, God's aseity. So again, if no one has any anything to say to sort about the Bible verses and the biblical study, or anything to add? We're going to move on. Last call? All right. Now, when we're talking about this so what does this mean? What does this quality mean to us? What does it indicate about God? What does it tell us about God? I think it points to a couple different things, in that minimally it means that God doesn't depend on anything else. That God is independent of everything. His existence does not depend on something happening in the universe that caused God to exist, unlike us. Unlike anything else in the world. Anything that exists is dependent on something else. There is nothing that we know of other than God that can explain itself, can explain its reason for being there. So I think that's the minimum thing that it tells us about God, that he exists independently. But there's a type of theology we're going to look at when we study this, and it's what's called perfect being theology, or Anselmian theology. And so it sort of helps us look at God's qualities, because the Bible sometimes isn't clear. So Anselm of Canterbury theorized that when we're discussing God, we should think of him as the greatest conceivable being. So when we talk about his attributes, we want to talk about them in what we can conceive of as the greatest possible way to have them. So that's sort of a control to think of, that when you're thinking about God, and I know how much it can feel overwhelming to your brain, it's you have to think about God in that way, the greatest conceivable quality that God could have. Because if you can think of something greater than that, then that would be God. That's sort of the way philosophers look at it. So perfect being theology is what it's called. And the reason I bring that up is because there is a modern sort of very small movement among some contemporary Christian circles in theology called personal creator theology. Now what this is that they don't think God is necessarily a perfect being, but he is their personal creator. And that they sort of reject some of these infinite qualities of God. They'll reject him being all-powerful, all-knowing. And the reason they do this is just because when we get to those qualities, you'll see problems arise that can create objections to God. And rather than answer these objections, they would rather say, well, no, God just doesn't have that. God doesn't have all knowledge. God isn't all-powerful. He's just my personal creator. And I reject that. I think I buy into this perfect being theology, that God is the greatest conceivable being. If you are these people that sort of hold on to this personal creator, there's a lot of things in the Bible that would oppose them on that. Again, just read some of the things even Isaiah said, and these other things that just came up. So I just wanted to bring that up. Again, it's not very mainstream. It's not big. You might not have heard it before. It's just sort of, especially in Christian philosophy world, it's just a way for these Christian philosophers not to have to answer some of these problems because they don't like the answers. So again, you see it on all sides. Atheists come up with convenient ways to get out of problems. It's just so. So again, minimally, God is independent. He doesn't depend on anything else. But using that, is that all that this quality is? Because let's use that perfect being theology. What else does this point to, God being self-existent? Because I think it's stronger than he just exists independently of anything. I think that it also means that God is eternal. That this points to God being eternal. Because to be self-caused, meaning that there's no way he could not have existed, he would have to be existing eternally. If God didn't exist eternally, if at some point in the past he came into existence, then there would be a reason for that outside of him. And that is not this quality. God does not have that. He's not dependent on something else for his existence. Again, when I wrote on the board eternality is going to be a quality we're going to talk about. So that's why this is going to lead to that. So again, if God does exist like we believe he does, then it is impossible for God not to exist. I think that is another quality of God's aseity, God's self-existence. it would be impossible for God to ever fail to exist as well. That, again, if at some point in the past, I use the past, but we're not talking about time, but before creation, if there was just some moment that God suddenly came into existence, that would mean before that moment, God failed to exist. But it's impossible for God to fail to exist. And this goes back to last year, so what is another side effect of, or a quality of God's aseity, is that God is a necessary being. Now, I remember the people that came last year, we talked about this. So I think some of you will have a grasp on this term. That, again, a necessary being is something that it's impossible for it to not exist. That God's very nature is that he exists. God's very nature is that he is a necessary being. And the opposite of a necessary being is a contingent being. Hopefully these words are sounding familiar to some of you. Now, a contingent being is something that is dependent upon something else, like us. We are contingent beings. We exist contingently. We have causes. Now, if you'll remember, there was an argument that was based on this whole quality. It was the Leibnizian cosmological argument. So again, we spent a couple of weeks just discussing this argument. And again, Leibnizian, it's the guy who came up with it, Leibniz. And so this argument is based upon the fact that the whole universe is contingent. Like the whole universe is not necessary. That everything that in the universe has a cause for its existence. Even if we don't know the cause, that we know that it had to have some reason for being there. And that God is not this. God is a necessary being. I mean, I'll read through the argument again, but if you weren't here last year and you don't really understand how arguments work, don't worry about it. So the argument goes like this. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or an eternal cause. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe is an existing thing, so in conclusion, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. Now, that argument might not mean anything to you because, as I remember last year, arguments have premises, and then we go through and explain each premise. And so we did that last year. We gave proofs for God's existence. So now we're talking about God. Who is God? And through that argument, we realized that God was a necessary being. Another way I want to sort of talk about necessity is that we talked a lot about, philosophers like to talk about possible worlds. And so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So imagine this is the actual world. This is this world where we live, where we exist, and the B represents me, Ben. This is the world where I'm up here teaching a class to you guys, and that's it. This is the actual world. This is the world that we know. Now, this world didn't have to be this way, and everyone, I think, can imagine that. My parents could have never met, and then I never would have been born. And then you would have minus B. This happened, I would not have existed. Now, this is what we call a possible world. This was a possibility that could have happened. It didn't happen. It's not the actual world, but it's a possible world. Choices could have been differently. Now, there could have been another world where my parents met, had a son, and named him Joe. Josiah. But this is just Joe. This is Joe. Now, if this case happened, that Joe is not the same as me. That wouldn't be me. This is another possibility that could have happened. So these are what are called possible worlds. These are things when we're talking about. There could be a world where I didn't hurt my ankle and I wouldn't be wearing this brace. That would have been a possible world. Hopefully you understand. Sometimes people have trouble with this. They think that there is no such thing as a possible world. And yes, there isn't another world out there where these things are, but these are possible worlds in our minds that we can conceive of. And I'm saying this to show to you that the world is not necessary. the world doesn't have to be this way. Like, it could have been a different way. That's what I mean by contingent. Now, if you think that, no, that these possible worlds couldn't have happened, then you're claiming that then this is necessary. Like, this must be this. Like, the world has to be exactly this way. And most philosophers will reject that because, like I just said, so many other things could have happened to get us to this point that could have been different. Now, why did I bring this up? God, being a necessary being, exists in all possible worlds. If this turned out to be the case, God would still exist. If this turned out to be the case, God would still exist. The difference between a necessary and a contingent is that everything is dependent upon God. God exists in all of this. None of this could happen without God. None of these possibilities could happen without God. I used mathematics to sort of illustrate it. Like, mathematical numbers aren't things. At least, I don't believe they are. Some people do. But like, the number 2 is the same in every possible world. Like, you can call it some other word. We can call it teeth, but it's still 2. It's still number 2. The amount is always 2. So a lot of times we'll use mathematics to sort of illustrate this, that, 2 is the same no matter what happens. The amount, the number, the quantity 2 is always the same. So this is a good way to sort of, not visualize, but sort of think about God being a necessary being. God is unchanging no matter what the circumstances are. Like I said, if there was this represents a world without God, like, this couldn't happen. You couldn't have a world without God. Like, existence is dependent on him and God being necessary. Like, someone can't say, well, there could have been a world where God didn't exist. And like, no, that world would never happen. Just like you can't have a number where 2 is not 2. So that's what we mean. That's what I mean by a necessary being. And that's what this quality of divine aseity is. This, as I said in the beginning, that it's the Latin, it's God exists from himself. He is self-existent. He does not have a cause, does not have a creator. And as we look back to the 1 John, where it says that the Word was with God and the Word was also God, that God and Christ have both existed throughout eternity. That God did not create Christ. They were both existing together. They're part of the Godhead. But again, don't think too much about that. We're going to get to that well into the future. I thought there'd be a lot more questions, so that's all I got on this, on aseity, because like I said, it's one of the simpler qualities. I know you might like, well, this is simple, but yes, it is one of the simpler ones.
So if things like God is necessary being, and so things can't exist without God, right? Because everything else would be considered contingent. Then in reality, then really there is like existence. There is no existence without God. So God in itself is the very nature of existence. Correct?
You're gonna have to explain what you mean by that.
Like,
because I don't want you to.
Because there can't be existence without God. Like, something can't exist unless God eternally existed to create something else, right? If everything else is contingent?
Yes.
So then God is existence.
No.
No?
No. Now, see, you're leading towards what you're going down the slope of what could be considered pantheism.
I knew he was going to say that, and I just wanted to leave.
So, like, pantheism is like the Eastern sort of religions, Hinduism, Jainism. Thank you, David. You're the man. Saw me struggling to get the last drop. So yes, like the Eastern religions are called pantheistic. They're pantheistic religions, and they're saying that God and existence are the same. And they also say, so that means that you are God, like your existence, God is existence, so then you are also God. So again, I want to warn you about saying that God and existence aren't interchangeable. Like, because God didn't need to create any of this. God would still be God even if he didn't create anything. So again, they're not one and the same. Like, they don't equal. Like that doesn't work
Right, because you can't flip it around.
because you can't flip it around. So that doesn't work because you can't say existence equals God. God is independent of existence.
So God's beyond existence.
That you're getting esoteric. Like, what does that mean?
I don't know yet, but I'm
Tommy doesn't have his microphone. God said so. God is beyond existence. But again, I think that's a. You should write those like little like phrases for like the Buddhist like calendars. Because again, a lot of it sounds good, but like sometimes it just is meaningless. You know, it doesn't really mean anything. Any other questions, Tommy?
No, I'm still thinking. I'll come back to you.
But you got what I meant by like they're not interchangeable. You know, it's not that existence is God. Gotta pass the microphone back. While they're passing the microphone back, that just I forgot because I skipped a part. I did say I would discuss what other religions think about these qualities and what they say. And this one, for the three religions of the book that they call them, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, this quality is basically the same throughout those religions. They all believe in God's self-existence. When you get to the Eastern religions, like I said, Hinduism, pantheism, Jainism, Taoism, they'll say yes and no. The nature of those religions is that they're contradictory. They say that God can both be necessary and contingent, which again sort of makes no sense, but that's the way they are. So again, it's unclear, like I said, that in Hinduism, God, they do believe like sort of in this ultimate God called the Atman or Brahman, but they believe that all existence is that. They believe that Tommy is Atman, David is Atman, I am Atman. We are all God, so we are all, in a sense, necessary. So that is where existence and God are interchangeable.
Exactly sure what I'm asking.
Sorry, I'm
But
not
I
sure what my answer will be.
So I have a bad cold. I think guitars are made out of wood.
Correct?
So if God never created trees, we can't say there wouldn't be any guitars, because then he could say, well, I'll teach man how to make guitars out of plastic. So guitars aren't dependent upon wood, they're dependent upon God.
Yes.
So we're saying that everything is dependent upon God, not on any particular thing that he created. I think that's what I'm saying.
So, I mean, because you're sort of talking, a guitar it starts as an idea. So, a guitar sort of comes from this idea I talked about of consciousness, like of a conscious being would create something like a guitar. I mean, there are animals that use tools, in a certain sense. I guess I think I know what you're sort of saying.
I'm not sure.
I mean, I don't want to say, like, again, these things sort of, maybe it can blur the lines where it's like, did God necessarily, like, directly create guitars? I would say no, again. But because we are also creative, because we are in the image of God, that we also have that ability.
Man can't create anything out of nothing, like
No,
God.
exactly, yes.
So, in a sense, I mean, there couldn't be a guitar without God.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Oh, that's what I was trying to say.
Yes, there could, because, I mean, and that goes back, you got more specific, but that goes back to what I said, that there couldn't be anything without God.
Yeah, right. Okay. I get it.
Without God, there would be nothing.
A trumpet is made out of brass. No. Could there be no. Once in a while I'll start thinking about eternity, and God always, obviously we can't conceive of it, but that God always was. And what was there? What did he do before he created eternity?
We're going to get there.
But here's my question or observation. We deal in time because we are, limited lifetime beings. So we probably can't conceive of time the way God does.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. Like I said, our next attribute of God we're going to be talking about is God's eternal attribute, God being eternal. So we will talk about that. We're going to get into this, so it's a good lead-in. Like you said, this is where we're going to come up with our first sort of disagreement about, as I said in my example, like, does God exist outside of time, or is he eternal within time? So again, there's two ways of looking at that. Again, as we'll discuss, but I mean, to sort of hint, I think before there was anything and there was only God, there was no time. Ultimately, time is a measurement of change. Like, you can think of seconds and hours, but time is as a state change. Time is when one thing happens and then something changes. But God, before there was anything, didn't change. So in essence, there was no time. God was just existing in his perfect Godhead.
I mean, obviously, we this side of heaven, we won't fully understand until we see him.
I mean, I don't think we'll ever fully understand the way God understands. Like, I don't think that's possible.
Even when we get there.
Yeah, I think we'll have a broader understanding, but I don't think we'll be able to experience it the way God experiences it.
I wonder when, before Adam and Eve sinned, if there wasn't time then.
There was. I mean, like I said, I think that as soon as something changed, there was time. Like, even before, as soon as God created something, that was the start of time. This is sort of my personal belief, and I'll get into it when we start discussing time. But when God created the heavens, or when he created the angels, that's time starts, because there was a state before the angels and a state after. Once you indicate before and after, time starts. Whether you don't, like I said, it might not be physical time, like there might not be hours and minutes and stuff passing, but there was a state change. There was a before and an after moment.
Ben,
Yes.
when I was little in Catholic school, Catholic CCD, we were taught, where did God come from? And the answer was, he always was and always will be. Is that line up with your...
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
There is, and again, this is something that atheist philosophers that are actual philosophers accept. They will say that if God exists, then he exists necessarily. Because I've talked about him before, Richard Dawkins, who is an evolutionary biologist, who wrote The God Delusion. In a debate, he brought up that question. He was like, well, where does God come from? And like, it was hard, like people watching would laugh at him. Like he didn't understand that, no, if God exists, God being the most supreme being would exist necessarily. So again, like, this is widely accepted among this field of study,
Is everything that God created eternal?
It depends on your definition of eternal.
Well, like God. God's eternal.
Yes.
So everything that God creates is eternal.
No, because it didn't exist before the moment of creation. Like, eternal goes both ways, Now, things that God created could be progressing infinitely, like we would go infinitely in one direction, but we're not eternal in the sense that we've always existed.
But we will move into eternity.
No, we can't, because we can't go backwards.
But as it goes forward.
Again, these are two, but you're talking about, again, it depends on how you define your terms. When we say God is eternal, we mean God has always existed and always will exist. Like, we didn't always exist. We may always continue to exist, but we didn't always exist. So again, we are not eternal in the way God is eternal. That's why I like to use the word infinite, like we're moving towards an infinite destination. Does that make sense? You still look a little confused.
Yeah, it does. But can I ask you another question? That when Jesus was God and came down and became part of man, did it change his nature?
No. I mean,
he took on the creation.
I wouldn't say it didn't change his nature, like the nature of, again, this question is moving, since you weren't here last week, we're going to talk about these things, because we're going to talk about God's immutability, which is God is unchanging. but that's God's nature. Like there are things about God that can change, like God's relationship to you can change because you could have, at one point in your life, didn't know God, and then you came to know God, so there was a change that happened there. So like God can change in some ways, but his nature, like the essence of who God is, doesn't change. So again, when God became man and became Christ, he didn't change his nature. Like Christ still had all the qualities of God, they were just sort of suspended. Again, this is it's not something that people agree on, and it's not something that's easy to describe. But when we get to the Trinity, which is, I know you want to answer this now, but we will talk about that.
I'm just in the sense that when Jesus became a man, the Bible says he understood now, or maybe not now, but he understood and could have compassion on us.
Yes.
Because he became a man and walked as a man. So did God learn something from that?
Again, this gets into God's when we talk about God being omniscient, like all-knowing. This gets into like God's knowledge. Again, I wouldn't say a good way to say this is that this is a very long answer, so sort of pay attention.
Yes, sir.
So, the one reason that I talked about Revelation last week, and that God is revealed through his word and through his son, Jesus Christ. But again, he gave us his word. The Bible is very important because it gives us what's called prescriptive truth. Like, basically, it's God's words in sentences, in phrases. Like, the word, truth only can be understood through words. So again, think of truth, and like without words, things aren't true or false. So what I want to say to you is talk about like God didn't give us. Ravi Zacharias said in the beginning, God didn't give us video. God didn't give us like the cell phone to take videos. Because how many times do you see someone takes a video in court and people interpret it a million different ways? People see one thing and other people see the other thing. But when you have a statement of truth, you can sort of think about it in different ways. You can learn different things, but it's either true or false. There is no sort of color coding it or sort of changing it. Like, can't edit it really. When God makes a statement, God makes a statement. So again, that being said, I think an experience doesn't change the truth of God. It doesn't change God's nature. I think maybe God didn't learn anything, but he had an experience. And that experience wasn't true or false. It didn't change God's nature, but he had an experience as a man. But he already knew everything about that experience. Like, he knew the facts of it. Like, I can know all the facts and I can know all the knowledge about certain things, and then there's also the experience of it.
And you learn something from the experience.
But you don't learn information.
Just feel it.
It's just like it's an experience.
So you just learn the experience itself.
Yes.
Okay.
I forgot what.
Yeah. We have another question back there.
No, it's just an observation, which, probably why he cried at Lazarus' tomb, because he saw what death and sadness, he knows what it is, but he actually experienced it.
Yeah, he also cried for us. It says that he cried for the people that lost Lazarus. But again, God knew Lazarus was going to die. He knew he was going to raise him from the dead, yet, again, that's that experience. He had an experience.
So, that if somebody bowls a 300,
Yeah, here we go. Bowling.
that they're going to feel really good on that last shot that's a perfect shot.
Yeah.
But if you've never bowled a 300, but you still know it's a good feeling, but then you bowl a 300 and you feel it, but you knew you were going to feel it.
Well said. Well said. Well said, Dave. Okay. Do you have a question, though?
No, I don't. I have a question, man.
Okay.
Can you just go over the leap in thing?
Okay, so I'm going to reiterate the. You want to hear the argument again?
Just, yeah, the overview, synopsis.
Of the Leibnizian argument?
Yeah.
Okay.
The premise.
All right, so the Leibnizian cosmological argument was what we talked about last year. It was one of our classes. Basically, I'll explain the argument real quick because not everyone was there. Like a philosophical argument has premises and then a conclusion. And basically, as long as all the premises follow from one another, then the conclusion follows from those premises. It's logically valid. And then the argument comes in arguing over the premises. You know, is these premises true or false? You never argue over the conclusion if the argument is proper form. Someone can't say, oh, I just reject that conclusion. Well, no, you can't. Like, what's wrong with one of the premises? So I'll read the argument again. This is the Leibnizian cosmological argument for God's existence. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe is an existing thing. Therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. So, again, we know the universe is an existing thing, premise 3, that sort of makes sense. So then, go back to premise 1, every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in a cause or in the necessity of its nature. The universe is not a necessarily existing thing, so it must have an explanation. That explanation would be God. Again, that's sort of when I did possible worlds. Again, if the universe was necessary, like possible worlds, again, wouldn't be possible. We're about at 7:30. Kids are crying. Hold on, one more.
Couldn't somebody argue that that is a false premise, that the universe has to have an explanation for its existence?
The argument doesn't say it has to have an explanation. The argument says it does have an explanation. But again, that just seems very counterintuitive. Like the argument is saying that every existing thing does have an explanation. Again, because how do you get something from nothing? You know, why does something exist? And again, this isn't a causal argument. We're not talking about what the cause is of the universe. We're talking about why is there a universe to begin with? Like why does this exist? And it's like the universe could be eternal. Like even if you give, say the universe has existed for all time, it's still what is the explanation of its existence? The way we talk about God. The reason God exists is because he is necessary. God is self-existent. So if you're saying the universe doesn't have an explanation, you're saying that the universe would then be self-existent, which is, most people deny that. Even people that reject this argument wouldn't say that the universe is self-caused. All right, so I think that's it. Thank you, guys.